My name is Finn Holt, and I want to tell you something about being last. Last on the score sheet, last on the assessment, last on every list that measures things the way most people measure them, with numbers and rankings and thresholds that tell you clearly and cleanly exactly where you stand relative to everyone else. I have been last my entire career. I stopped caring about it somewhere around year 4, when I understood that the lists were measuring the right things for the people who designed them, and the wrong things for me, and that the gap between those two categories was where I actually lived and worked and where everything I was genuinely useful for happened. The Catherian deep space research vessel Solon had a crew of 22, and on every formal assessment their chief operations officer, a precise and thorough Catheran named Commander Vile Sen, had run since I joined the mission 6 months ago. I placed last or close to it. Physical response time. Last, sensory processing speed. Second to last, technical certification scores on Catheran equipment, standards. Last, Commander Vale Sen did not say anything directly about my scores. She was too professional for that, but she assigned me the work that corresponded to my assessed capability, which was the support work, the background work, the work that needed doing and was not glamorous, and did not require the skills that scored high on her assessments. I did it thoroughly, and I did not complain, and I used every spare hour to learn the ship. Not the systems I was assigned to, all of them. I had a specific way of learning ships that I had developed over 12 years, and that I had never been able to explain adequately to anyone who asked because it was not a method exactly. It was more of a disposition. I treated every ship I worked on as a complete thing, a single integrated object rather than a collection of separate systems, and I tried to understand the complete thing rather than the individual parts. Most engineers understood their assigned systems deeply and the rest of the ship adequately. I understood the whole ship at a level that was slightly less than deep across everything, which scored poorly on assessments that tested system-specific expertise but gave me something that system-specific expertise did not, which was the ability to see what happened when things that were not supposed to interact with each other started interacting. That ability was not on Commander Vale Sen's assessment criteria. It was, however, the thing that mattered on the night the Solon ran into trouble. The trouble started with something small. A power fluctuation in the secondary grid that the automated system flagged, handled with a standard reroute and closed the alert on. Routine. The kind of thing that happened on deep space vessels regularly and was managed automatically and forgotten by the next shift. I did not forget it. Not because the fluctuation was alarming in itself, it was not, but it was the third fluctuation in the secondary grid in 11 days, and the previous 2 had been in different sections, and the automated system had handled each one independently, without connecting them, because they were in different sections, and the automated system was not designed to look for patterns across sections. I had been watching the 3 fluctuations for 11 days and building a picture of what they meant together that was different from what each one meant together that was different from what each one meant alone. And the picture I had built was not a comfortable one. The secondary grid was not experiencing isolated fluctuations. It was experiencing a progressive load redistribution that was moving through the grid, section by section in a pattern that matched a specific type of insulation degradation in the primary power conduit that ran the length of the ship under the main deck. If I was right, the conduit was failing. Not immediately, but the progression I had mapped suggested a critical threshold within 48 to 72 hours, within 48 to 72 hours, and a primary conduit failure on a deep space vessel. 4 days from the nearest station was the kind of event that the mission briefings described in the section titled Scenarios Requiring Immediate Response. I filed a report to Commander Vale Sen at the end of my shift. She read it that evening and found me in the engineering section the next morning. She stood in the doorway and looked at me with pale gray eyes that held the particular expression of someone who was taking something seriously that they had not expected to need to take seriously. She asked me to walk her through the analysis. I walked her through it. Every fluctuation, every date, every section, the progression pattern, the conduit degradation model I had built from the maintenance documentation, and the 11 days of data, the timeline I had calculated. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She asked if I had shown this to the chief engineer. I said not yet. I had filed the report to her first because the chief engineer would want to know her response before deciding how to allocate inspection resources. She looked at the data again. She said the pattern analysis connected 3 events that were in different sections and had been handled by different crew members on different shifts. I said yes. She said no one else had connected them. I said the automated system was not designed to look across sections. The crew members who handled each event saw a resolved routine fluctuation. The pattern was only visible if you were looking at all three together. She said, "Why were you looking at all three together?" I said, "I watched the whole ship." She was quiet. She said, "My last assessment score for technical analysis was in the lower third." I said the assessment tested system-specific analysis. This is whole ship pattern analysis. They are different skills. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she called the chief engineer. The inspection team found the conduit degradation exactly where I had predicted it would be, in the section between frames 11 and 14. Progressed to a point that the chief engineer, a Kethiron named Orville, who was experienced and thorough and clearly shaken by what the inspection had found, said was closer to the critical threshold than my timeline had suggested. Not 48 to 72 hours. Closer to 18. Commander Vale Sen found me in the observation deck that evening. She sat down beside me without preamble and looked out at the deep space dark for a moment before she spoke. She said the repair was underway and would be completed before the threshold was reached. I said good. She said Orville estimated that if the conduit had reached the critical threshold, the resulting cascade would have taken out primary life support within 4 hours of failure onset. I did not say anything because there was nothing useful to add to that. She said 22 crew members. I said I know. She looked at me. She said, "You filed the report after your shift ended. You had been monitoring this for 11 days on your own time." I said I wanted to be sure of the pattern before I filed. 3 data points was enough to be confident, but I wanted to double-check my conduit degradation model before I put it in front of you. She said you double-checked it. I said twice. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." I said, "Of course." She said, "When you joined this crew, your assessments placed you at the bottom of most categories. In 6 months, that has not changed. Your scores on the formal assessments are still where they were." I said, "Yes." She said, "But in 6 months, you have also learned this ship at a level of whole system integration that I have not seen in a crew member at any rank." I said, "I watch the whole ship, I always have." She said, "That is not on any assessment I run." I said, "I know." She said, "Why not?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Because you have to know what you are looking for to design a test for it, and you have to know something is possible before you look for it." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "The assessment criteria." I said, "Yes." She said, "They are incomplete." I said, "They measure important things. They just do not measure everything important." She looked out at the deep space dark, and I looked with her, and the Solon moved through it steadily and quietly, with her primary conduit being repaired 3 decks below us, and 22 crew members who did not know how close the night had come to going differently. She said, "Finn Holt." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your next assessment." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am adding a category." I said, "What category?" She looked at me. She said, "Whole ship pattern recognition." And I am writing the criteria myself this time. I looked at her. She said, "I expect you to score first." I said, "I expect I will." She almost smiled. It was the same almost smiled. It was the same almost smile I had seen twice before. In 6 months, and both times it had meant she had encountered something that had shifted her understanding of something she had been certain of. She stood up and smoothed her uniform with the precise habit of someone who had been in command for a long time. She said the repair team would want a full review of the degradation model in the morning, and she wanted me in that meeting. I said I would be there. She walked back toward the command deck, and I stayed in the observation deck for a while and watched the deep space dark and thought about being last. Last on the score sheet. Last on the assessment. Last on every list, and first on the one that mattered tonight. That was enough. It had always been enough. I got up and went to get some rest. The morning meeting was going to be a long one, and I had a degradation model to review, and I wanted it to be accurate down to the last detail because accurate down to the last detail was the only way I knew how to do anything. It always had been.